The luxurious restaurant buzzed with the chatter of the elite, each conversation punctuated by the soft clinking of crystal glasses. The chandeliers above glimmered in the dim light, casting a warm glow on the guests, who were all impeccably dressed. But for Sophie, the woman standing at the entrance, the world inside felt foreign. She was no stranger to wealth. After all, she was married to one of the wealthiest men in the room. But tonight, as they stepped into this exclusive venue, Sophie felt like an outsider. Her simple dress, tasteful yet unassuming, was a far cry from the dazzling gowns worn by the women around her, and her shoes, comfortable flats, seemed like a glaring contrast to the towering stilettos that clicked across the floor in every direction. She could feel the eyes of the guests upon her, sizing her up, judging her silently. She glanced at her husband, Michael, whose confidence was as natural as breathing. He was accustomed to these circles, to the stares and the whispers, the subtle judgments that came with wealth and status. Michael carried it all with ease. His perfectly tailored suit, his calm demeanor, his effortless way of fitting into any room. Sophie, on the other hand, felt the sting of the unspoken comparisons. She was nothing like the women here. She was simply Sophie, quiet, unpretentious, and used to a different kind of life. As the maitre d' led them to their table, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being judged by every person she passed. They didn't know her, yet they sized her up, judging her appearance and questioning why someone like Michael would choose someone like her. She tried to ignore the subtle glances, the quiet whispers that she knew were directed at her, but it was impossible not to notice. She had always been someone who preferred simplicity, someone who felt most at ease in a more casual setting. But tonight she had to face this world of glittering wealth, a world she had never fully embraced. Sophie and Michael were seated at a quiet corner table, and as she tried to relax, she noticed the looks they were getting. A group of men and women at the table next to theirs had already turned their attention toward them. Sophie could hear their murmurs, though they were careful to keep their voices low. One woman glanced over at Sophie's dress and muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "She doesn't look like she belongs here." Probably just another charity event guest. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had expected this. She had been in Michael's world long enough to know how people thought, how they looked at her. But it didn't make it any easier. It wasn't just the dress, it was her. She was different from them. She didn't have their polished sophistication or their impeccable style. She had never needed those things. But tonight, the weight of their judgment was heavier than she had anticipated. She looked up at Michael, who was already deep in conversation with some influential guests. He was oblivious to the silent judgment swirling around them, and Sophie realized that this was what bothered her most. Not the whispers or the looks, but the fact that Michael didn't even notice. To him, this was just another evening in a world he was born into. To her, it was a reminder of how different they were. Sophie straightened in her seat, silently telling herself to let it go. She wasn't just here as Michael's wife, she was Sophie, a woman who had earned her place at this table just as much as anyone else. She might not fit their mold, but she belonged here. She just had to remember that. The evening wore on, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. The other guests around her engaged in lively discussions about investments, art collections, and social affairs. Their voices filled with the kind of confidence that came from years of operating in this world. Sophie felt out of her depth, her responses coming out slower than they should have, as if she was still trying to catch up to the language of this elite world. Michael, however, was in his element. His charisma seemed to make everyone around him feel at ease. He spoke with ease, his words flowing smoothly, and his confident laughter filled the space. It was as though he was the sun, and everyone around him was drawn into his orbit. And there she was, sitting at his side, feeling like an accessory rather than a participant. Sophie tried to remind herself that she wasn't just Michael's wife. She had her own life, her own achievements, her own place in the world. She had come from humble beginnings, working hard to build the life they now had. But none of that mattered to these people. They saw her as someone who didn't fit their world. The subtle glances from across the room, the quiet murmurs, they all seemed to be saying the same thing. She doesn't belong here. As the evening stretched on, Sophie found herself once again the subject of whispers. A group of women, elegantly dressed in designer gowns, were seated nearby, their conversation drifting toward her. They hadn't tried to be discreet this time. Woman 1. Who's that with Michael Thompson? She certainly doesn't seem like his type. Woman 2. Probably some charity event guest. You know, the type they throw in for appearances. Woman 1. I can't believe he's with someone so ordinary. Sophie could feel the words like a weight pressing down on her chest. She wanted to disappear, to escape this moment where she felt so out of place. But instead, she sat there, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, trying to breathe through the discomfort. Michael, oblivious to the conversation happening behind them, laughed at something a man across the table said, his voice warm and genuine. Sophie couldn't help but watch him. He was so confident, so sure of himself in a way that she had always admired. But there was a part of her that resented how easily he fit into this world, a world where wealth and status were everything. She was never meant to be a part of it. And tonight, it felt like a constant reminder of that fact. Just then, one of the women from the nearby table stood up and made her way over to their table. She was tall, with perfectly styled hair and a sharp, scrutinizing look in her eyes. Sophie knew exactly what she was doing, circling around, trying to size her up, trying to figure out where she fit into the social hierarchy. Sophie had seen it before. This wasn't the first time she had been judged for her simple appearance, and it wouldn't be the last. Woman 3. Michael, she said, flashing him a bright smile, her voice dripping with sweetness. I didn't realize you were bringing a guest tonight. Her gaze flicked toward Sophie, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she studied her. Sophie met her gaze directly, refusing to let her discomfort show. Michael, cheerfully. Yes, this is Sophie. We're just here for a quiet evening trying to unwind. Sophie, this is Allison. She's a regular at the club. Allison, smiling coolly. How lovely. I must say, you have such a unique sense of style, Sophie. Her tone was sharp, the compliment laced with something far less genuine. Sophie could tell that Allison wasn't interested in a real conversation. She was merely toying with her, trying to provoke a reaction. Sophie's heart beat in her throat, but she kept her smile in place, knowing she couldn't let Allison get the better of her. Sophie's voice remained steady. Thank you. I prefer to keep things simple. Allison's smile tightened just slightly, as if she hadn't expected that response. For a brief moment their eyes locked, and Sophie could see the shift in Allison's expression, a flicker of surprise that quickly turned to something like disdain. The woman turned to walk away, but not before giving Sophie one last look over her shoulder, her eyes filled with silent judgment. Sophie sat back, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over her. She hadn't let Allison's comment bother her. She hadn't let any of it bother her. Adam had always said she was strong. Tonight, she was starting to believe it. Sophie wasn't here to be measured by their standards. She was here because she belonged, just as much as anyone else in this room. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of champagne toasts, delicate hors d'oeuvres, and shallow conversations. Sophie felt like she was floating through it all, a part of the scene, but never truly immersed in it. The glances, the comments, the subtle exclusion, she felt them all, but they no longer held the power to hurt her as they once had. There was a shift in her that she couldn't explain, something quiet but fierce that had been slowly building over the course of the evening. Michael, of course, remained unaware. His charm and self-assurance carried him effortlessly from one conversation to the next, his reputation and wealth speaking for him in every room. It wasn't that he didn't care about Sophie, he just didn't see what she saw. To him, this world was second nature, and in some ways, he couldn't understand the discomfort she felt. He had never experienced life from her perspective, and that realization hit Sophie harder than any judgment from the others. As the night wore on, the crowd began to thin out, and the energy in the room shifted. The laughter softened, and the conversations became more intimate, as though the elite guests were testing the boundaries of what they could reveal. Sophie sat in the corner, nursing her glass of wine, trying to appear engaged in the conversation Michael was having with a group of investors. But her mind kept drifting back to the judgment, to the way she had been looked at, like she didn't belong. Her thoughts were interrupted when one of the men from the group, an older, balding man named Gregory, leaned in toward her as if he had just made an interesting observation. He had been watching her for a while, a faint smirk on his face as he studied her with obvious curiosity. Gregory. "So, Sophie," he began with a tone that was casual, but Sophie could tell he was about to say something meant to provoke her. "Tell me, what's it like being married to a man like Michael? You know, a man who seems to have the world at his feet." Sophie hesitated for a moment, feeling the familiar pressure of being under the microscope. She could already sense where this conversation was headed. Gregory was probing, testing, perhaps trying to gauge if she was worthy of standing by Michael's side. Gregory, chuckling, "I imagine you must feel a bit out of place in all this luxury. After all, Michael could have married someone with more pedigree, don't you think?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sophie could see the others at the table looking on with interest. The silence stretched out, the pressure mounting as they waited for her reaction. Sophie took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. She wasn't going to shrink back into herself or apologize for who she was, for the life she had built with Michael. This was her moment to stand tall. "Sophie," calmly but with quiet strength, "Michael married me because of who I am, not because of my wealth or my background, but because we're a good match. I don't need a pedigree to know that. And frankly, I'm not here to prove anything to anyone." Her words hung in the air, simple and steady, and for a moment no one spoke. The group exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her directness. It wasn't the response they had expected, but it was the response Sophie needed to give. She wasn't here to compete with their standards, to make them think she was worthy of Michael's world. She was worthy simply because she was herself. Gregory blinked, his smirk faltering as he processed what she had said. There was a brief silence before he cleared his throat, his demeanor shifting. "Well, I suppose there's something to be said for that," he muttered, suddenly more uncomfortable than he had been before. The conversation quickly moved on, but Sophie couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of victory. She had spoken up, not just for Michael, but for herself. The rest of the night passed without any more subtle jabs or insults. Sophie felt a change inside her, a quiet confidence that had been born from standing her ground. She wasn't here to prove herself to anyone. She was here because she belonged, and she was learning to accept that. As Michael led her out of the restaurant later that night, his hand gently resting on her back, Sophie realized that she had come full circle. She no longer needed to measure herself against the world's expectations. She was enough, just as she was. And as they walked into the cool night air, she knew that this was just the beginning. Her strength, her worth, was not determined by anyone else's opinion. It had always been inside her. The drive back to their penthouse was silent, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Sophie sat next to Michael, the soft hum of the car's engine the only sound between them. Her mind was still racing, replaying the evening, Gregory's comment, the whispers, her response. She had spoken her truth, but the question still lingered. Why had it taken so long for her to speak up? Why had she allowed herself to feel less than before? Michael, sensing her quiet contemplation, glanced at her, his voice breaking the stillness. "You did great tonight, Sophie. I saw how you handled things with Gregory. You didn't back down, and that's exactly what I love about you." Sophie turned to him, a small smile forming on her lips, but it was tinged with uncertainty. "I didn't feel great. I felt out of place, like I was constantly being judged, watched, measured against people who have nothing to do with me." Michael's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're stronger than you think. You've always been strong. You just needed to see it yourself." Sophie let his words settle, a warmth spreading through her. She had never felt like she had to prove herself to Michael. He had always supported her, accepted her as she was. But tonight something had shifted. Tonight she realized that the opinions of others didn't matter. She didn't need their approval to feel good about who she was. "I've been trying so hard to fit in," Sophie admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "Trying to be someone I'm not. But the more I tried, the more I felt like I didn't belong." Michael nodded thoughtfully, his eyes never leaving the road. "You don't need to fit in, you already do. You just have to be you, Sophie. That's why I fell in love with you. Because of who you are, not because of who you try to be." Sophie took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her, as if a weight had been lifted. She had spent so much time hiding her true self, thinking she had to conform to a world that wasn't hers. But now, she was starting to realize that her worth wasn't dependent on others' validation. It was enough just to be Sophie, just to be herself. When they arrived home, Sophie stood for a moment in the doorway of their penthouse, looking out over the city skyline. The lights twinkled like stars, but they didn't feel as distant anymore. She wasn't an outsider in this world. She had a place here, next to Michael, yes, but also in her own right. "Are you okay?" Michael asked softly, standing beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. Sophie smiled, her heart lighter than it had been all evening. "I'm more than okay. I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Michael kissed her forehead, a soft, tender gesture. "I'm proud of you, Sophie. You don't need to change for anyone. You're perfect just as you are." In that moment, Sophie realized that the most important approval was her own. She didn't need to live up to anyone else's standards, especially not those of people who had never truly known her. She was strong, capable, and worthy, regardless of what anyone else thought. As she turned away from the window and into Michael's embrace, Sophie felt a new sense of confidence, the kind that came from knowing her own worth. The world could try to judge her, mock her, measure her against its impossible standards, but she was no longer worried about fitting into it. She was creating her own space, one where she could be herself, without apologies or compromises. And with Michael by her side, Sophie knew she was ready to face whatever came next, fully embracing who she was and the power she held. The next morning, Sophie woke up feeling different, lighter, more centered than she had in a long time. The harshness of the previous night's judgment had faded, replaced with a quiet sense of confidence. She had faced the subtle barbs, the whispered judgments, and she had stood firm. She hadn't backed down, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie realized that she didn't need anyone else's approval to feel valuable. She was enough just as she was. As Michael stirred beside her, she couldn't help but smile. He had been so patient with her, offering unwavering support throughout it all. But it wasn't just his support that had carried her. It was her own realization that she was strong, capable, and worthy of respect. Michael stirred, his hand reaching for hers in the dim light of the morning. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep but warm with affection. Sophie smiled, squeezing his hand. "Good morning." He opened his eyes, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "You're quiet this morning? Something on your mind?" Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the conversation she had been avoiding. It wasn't easy to admit, but the change inside her was undeniable. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady. "Last night, I realized something important. I don't need to try to fit into anyone else's world anymore. I don't have to change myself for their approval. I have a place in this world just as I am." Michael sat up slightly, propping himself up on one elbow, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he smiled, soft and genuine, and pulled her into his arms. "I've always known that, Sophie. You're incredible just the way you are. I'm proud of you, but I've always been proud of you." Sophie rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under her ear. "Thank you. I think I just needed to hear it from myself, too." The silence between them was comforting, filled with understanding. For the first time, Sophie didn't feel like she was living in someone else's world. She wasn't the wife of a billionaire or the woman who needed to live up to others' standards. She was Sophie, a woman who had her own value, her own strength, and her own worth. And now, she finally saw it. As the morning unfolded, they made their way downstairs for breakfast. Sophie was still basking in the clarity she had gained from the night before. She wasn't pretending anymore, and it felt freeing. She noticed the subtle shift in how she carried herself, how she walked into the kitchen with her shoulders back, her head held high. There was no more hesitation, no more questioning if she belonged. She knew she did. After breakfast, Michael received a call from one of his business associates, inviting them to another high society event. The usual thought would have been for Sophie to go through the motions, to dress in a way that would fit in with the crowd. But this time, as she stood in front of the mirror, picking out her clothes, she smiled to herself. She chose the outfit she felt most comfortable in, something elegant but simple, just like her. It was a small thing, but it was a powerful statement. She didn't need to wear the latest designer to be worthy of attention. She was worthy because of who she was. As she dressed, she glanced over at Michael, who was still on the phone, and realized that this moment wasn't about fitting in. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about being confident in her own skin. Sophie had finally learned the most important lesson of all. She didn't need to change for anyone. She was enough as she was. The evening arrived, and as they stepped into the event, Sophie felt an unfamiliar ease. She wasn't scanning the room for approval, and she wasn't second-guessing her presence. She was here as herself, and that was more than enough. The evening was unlike any other Sophie had attended. As she and Michael walked into the grand hall of the luxurious venue, Sophie felt a sense of calm wash over her. The soft hum of laughter, the gentle clink of glasses, and the swirl of conversation around her no longer seemed to intimidate her. Instead, she was simply present, standing tall, no longer seeking approval or measuring herself against anyone else's expectations. Michael moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who had spent his life navigating these spaces. But tonight, Sophie wasn't just following him. She was walking beside him, confident in her own right. Her presence was quiet, but undeniable. As they made their way through the room, a few familiar faces turned to greet them. Sophie smiled politely, but her eyes no longer darted around, looking for signs of judgment. She wasn't concerned about what anyone thought of her appearance, her dress, or her shoes. She had already claimed her worth, and it didn't depend on their approval. At one point, they were greeted by a group of Michael's associates, including Gregory, the man who had mocked her the night before. He stood up as they approached, his eyes widening slightly when he saw Sophie. His earlier dismissiveness was gone, replaced with something more guarded, maybe even respectful. Gregory. "Ah, Michael. I didn't expect to see you two here tonight," he said, his voice smoother than before. He offered Sophie a tight smile. his eyes scanning her in a way that made her feel like he was trying to reassess her. Sophie met his gaze without flinching, her expression steady. "It's a pleasure to be here," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm sure we'll have a lovely time." The subtle shift in Gregory's demeanor didn't escape her. He had once looked at her with disdain, but now there was an air of caution, as though he wasn't sure how to handle the new version of Sophie in front of him. She had never seen him so unsure, and it made her realize just how far she had come in such a short time. As they continued talking to the group, Michael's hand rested casually on Sophie's back, a silent signal of his support, of his pride in her. The evening passed in a way Sophie had never expected. The whispers, the glances, the subtle mockery, none of it touched her. She had embraced her own power, and the people around her began to sense it. By the end of the night, Sophie was no longer just the woman beside Michael. She was Sophie, confident, self-assured, and more than capable of holding her own. When the event came to a close and they made their way back to the car, Michael looked at her with a knowing smile. "Michael, you were amazing tonight, Sophie. You handled everything with grace, and I could see it." Everyone's perception of you shifted. Sophie smiled back, the weight of the evening lifting as she realized the truth in his words. It wasn't about how others saw her. It was about how she saw herself. She had taken her place in this world, and no one could take that away from her. Sophie's voice was steady, filled with newfound strength. "I didn't need their approval, Michael. I just needed to believe in myself." As the car pulled away from the event, Sophie looked out at the city lights, feeling a quiet sense of victory settle in her chest. She had faced the judgment of the elite and had come out the other side stronger. No longer defined by the opinions of others, Sophie knew that she was more than enough, just as she was.